Very nice of you.
That's the
Ready to start.
yes.
Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Audit Committee. I'll go through the usual prologue of the meeting. This committee. My name is Councillor Peter Marriott and I'm the chairman of the committee. Members and officers, please raise your hand to indicate that you wish to speak. Please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. Please can I also ask us any questions that have brief and to the point. If the webcast stream fails, then we'll also have to adjourn until they are able to reset the connection. Okay, thank you. On to the agenda then. The first item is apologies for absence. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillor George Wilson, and I am going to make a presumption that there's an apology from Councillor Dixon. Thank you.
Thank you. The next item is the minutes of the last meeting. We are asked to confirm the minutes held on the 28th of November. Are we happy with those minutes?
Chairman, I've got a couple of observations, if I may. First, on the risk management parts of the minutes, and we had the action to have an informal session on the corporate risk register. That itself was a postponement of a review of the strategic risk register, and that, of course, hasn't yet happened. We're rather anxious that we do at some point review the strategic risk register. I think it was mentioned last time that the collaboration risk register has been put together, has been considered, and we need to evaluate that the two are aligned. So I know it's an action point, so you mind hearing what the update of that is. That's, if I should just go on, the other points were last in the minutes, Councillor Seaborn, I think, correctly raised the concerns about the inability to deliver the audited accounts. I note that on the website, I think it's the RFO notice is still up, so I would be grateful to have an update on exactly where that is. Where we are with the audited accounts. I couldn't see that actually on the agenda, so that's number two. And then thirdly, last meeting we had a discussion regarding Horizon, and again we agreed to have a session to go into some of the reasons on that. We obviously had that, but I don't see in the minutes or the agenda a sort of follow-up. I think if we do have informal sessions, there ought to be for the minutes and for the record something that so third parties can see that we have examined it. We have got assurance and comfort from those discussions. So I want to not ask how we're going to affect that. Sorry.
Thank you. On your last point, I agree with you entirely. I think those sorts of meetings should be reported at this meeting. We should have a section here that covers those discussions. Thinking of any actions that might arise from that. That will be something, I guess, for the next session.
Yeah. What I will do is on the 17th of April, we are getting a new Democratic Services Manager. So I will raise with him comments made, and we can sort of discuss as a team about taking notes in informal sessions, and then we can circulate those action points.
Now I know that Kim may have some.
I believe I seem to remember scribbling some comments down, so I will dig out that notepad and and find the comments that were made.
If you could, I think that's
Yeah.
important, not just for that specific one, but as you say, for all.
Yes, yeah, I'll take it to my manager to.
So could you report on that, please, at the next audit
Yes.
meeting? And that's
Yeah.
convenient. Those other 2 points you mentioned, Julia, Peter, is that something you could respond to? The risk management and the horizon, the audited accounts. Do you know any more about it?
Rosie, I'll update on where we're at with the audited accounts, with the auditors.
So for the audit, we're not yet complete with our audit. We were hoping to be bringing the auditor's report this evening. Unfortunately, they were only prepared to provide us a draft report. So we've held them off at the moment and said we want a final. That was in light of a couple of years ago in particular, we ended up coming back to audit committee a number of times. So they are aiming to have it completed by the end of the month. So it should be a matter of weeks away. We're hoping sooner than that so that we can come back to the audit committee with the final report. So far, only 2 minor changes in notes have been requested, and we have made them in the copy that we plan to keep as our final. Everything else, there are minor recommendations at this stage, but they are just finalising particularly valuation work, which is always the last battle that we have.
So again, that won't come to audit till the next administration. So
It's true, that's fine.
Chairman, can I? Is this going to be? Do you think next year will be better? Because this is there's a staggering deterioration in service compared to even a couple of years ago.
So the underlying issue, it's a pill on this one, Stephen, because the audit fees doubled. We went out to tender through the PSAA, which is the national negotiation, letting the audit contracts. And the underlying issue hasn't changed, is that the audit companies, the big accounting companies, can't resource audits. They just can't get the people. So they've gone abroad. So they've gone first to India to resource people. So they're doing it online from India to these audits. And that situation hasn't changed for them. They're not getting people into the profession. And it's a better pill, because as much as we've put more money on the table and didn't get the option about it, it's not helping their resourcing. So the answer is that we would expect a similar service in reality going forward.
In terms of our own responsibilities and obligations, is that being recognised as we're simply responsible for providing our version of the accounts? Then we have to take part up with whether the auditor can find the people to actually perform the audit.
So that's pretty much the case. We fulfil our side of the obligation and make sure the quality of our audit papers are there. They're there on time, published on time. We sketch in an audit planned date for the audit of the auditors. That tends to get knocked back. They've got a very narrow window of opportunity to audit local authorities, because they also audit the NHS. And the time span of the NHS is fairly narrow as well. So they tend to audit the NHS from late March right through till June. So the auditors won't be, if they're auditors on last year's accounts before the end of March, which we're in that situation now, if they don't physically get it signed off by then, they'll not be back until June, late June, to start to look at the sign off, and then current year audit will begin potentially, but they'll have a backlog. So it's a lottery. There is a national negotiation, it's a consultation through SIPFA around changing the audit requirements. But that's all it is at the moment. There's nothing on the table in terms of what actually may change in that regime.
Thank you.
We're following on from that, and Rose has indicated that the report will be available before this council finishes. It would seem reasonable to me that we convene an extra meeting of this committee, because I think it would be totally inappropriate for it to be rolled on to a brand new committee who may or may not have any background as to what they're looking at.
Chairman, if and when that report is available, as soon as we get that, we'll be in a position to move on calling a committee together.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be penciling that in at this point in time. So, maybe asking you unnecessarily.
I mean, you'd be looking at some time in April to do that. But let's go for that then, so we can fit that in.
My sense is that we, on our part, your team, gets its bit of work done in a timely manner. But I do feel concerned that we are, because of the delays, we're continuing to put resource in to addressing our audit. Do you have any idea as to roughly how many man-hours, man-days this delay has caused us?
It's a tricky one. It doesn't cause. The only overlap really is if the audit team changes or they go off site for 3 or 4 months and then they come back. There's an element of rework on their side where they'll going over what they did already because it's a new team and they just cover that ground. From our perspective, the real challenge for us is the timing of the audits because we don't get time in the whole financial cycle anymore. We don't get the downtime that we would have had years ago when the publication date was many months later into September. So we get the accounts closed, we publish, ideally we straight into audit. That runs into the summer holiday period, July, August. By the time we get into September, we're looking at mid-year position, we're looking at MTFP position, we're looking at teeing up for next year's financial position. We've been teeing up on capital and the asset accounting because that's the earliest part of the whole process of getting valuations updated. And moving the audit towards the year end or later into the summer actually causes us resource issues within the team because we're trying to resource an audit as well as trying to do budget work and monitoring and everything else that's going on. So it knocks the whole profile out of work for the team. It's a smaller but effective team, but there is a limit to that capacity.
Yeah. Thanks.
In terms of juniors, a comment about the risk discussions, is that going to be better done with the new audit? You're going to have to go through the risk issues again in some detail when you get the new members of the committee. Is that better to do it at that point or do it to this committee now in the next few weeks?
So Robin Taylor's now taken up the risk and he's doing, he's bringing in a uniform risk approach across both councils so that doing the collaboration so that the joint management team working in one risk sphere rather than having two totally different risk regimes. And he's working on that with his team at the moment. So the most effective time probably would be early in the new cycle.
You have to do that too.
Yeah, I think because it's not just looking at the register, it's the whole of the risk management strategy and the governance about it. And consciously sort of taken over, given him the chance to work out what he feels he needs to do. But given that we've had two meetings now that's been postponed, I would like to see it on the next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on to the next item on the agenda then, which is disclosure of interest.
None given, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Questions by members of the public coming to the floor?
None, Chair.
And from members?
No.
So we move on to substantive item, which is item 6, the accounting policy on pages 1 to 24. We're asked to consider this in terms of the adequacy of the accounting policies Underpins preparation of financial statements, etc., for the years 2022-23 and 23-24. Sandra, as you're going to lead us into this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So annually we carry out a review of our accounting policies. They, like it says there, they set out how we deliver the accounts, how we assess depreciation, valuations, and all matter of kind of accounting assumptions, estimations, and judgments. So they're the kind of what underpins how we deliver our accounts. And each year we review that document to make sure it's still in line with the CITFA code, but also our current treatment within the team, and whether it's carrying out what we're aiming to do within the confines of the code. Are they delivering best and accurate value? For example, is it delivering a set of accounts that is clear, true, and meaningful? It's just making sure that they're still appropriate each year for each new year's accounts. So over the last few years, there's been very little changes in accounting standards from CITFA, particularly since COVID hit, since that pandemic period. CITFA have actually made the conscious decision to make minimal changes to the standards. That is partially to give a stable environment for local authorities to minimise the resource impact of any accounting changes, but also the resource impact on auditors. So at the moment we are, I'm going to say fortunate, but whether it is or not, I don't know, but fortunate to have a stable environment for our accounts, which helps them actually be more comparable as well across the years. So at the moment we don't have any major accounting changes coming forward for 23-24 that are having a material impact on our accounts for the next year or even the current financial year. However, we have reviewed them as usual just to make sure they are appropriate. And there is one small change that we would like to propose, and it is more around clarity and to make sure that we are exactly in line with the code rather than making material changes to our treatment. So the change that we are proposing is in section 1.17, and it's on page 17 of the standards, but I have pulled out the original wording and the new wording on page 2 of the report in the proposed changes area. And actually it is just separating out the different classes of assets and providing clarity on how depreciation is charged on each class. In the prior year's version, we had amalgamated together infrastructure assets, community assets, and assets under construction. And what we've done now is separate them out into each of their own bullet points with the depreciation or valuation method appropriate to each class in line with the CITFA code, hopefully to give some clarity and just some more understandable accounts. So for example, when you look at the accounts at the moment, we do not actually charge depreciation on assets under construction and community assets. However, in the prior version, it looks like we do because we call it depreciated historical costs. So it's separating it out to give that clarity and make sure that we are in line with the code more clearly for members of the public, but also for auditors to make that process a little bit easier. So this won't have a material impact on our asset values in the accounts. We are actually following the code in our accounts anyway, and what we really have is a lack of clarity in our policies that we're trying to rectify now. So that is the only proposed change for 23-24, and actually in the papers we propose that we make it in the current year as well to make sure we rectify it as soon as possible.
So in fact, there's no change to the numbers at all.
There is no
You're
changes
actually
to the
following
numbers.
the correct
We're following the
approach.
correct code, and actually our policy just needs tightening up.
A question on how you deal with the depreciation, if I read this correctly, you apply linear depreciation over the whole of the lifetime of the asset, or whatever it comes to be. Does that work? And well, perhaps it does work in the sense that, let's say you have a motor vehicle, you know it depreciates a lot of the first year or two, and tails off. Now, if you have a number of vehicles, of course, spread over purchase years, then it's an average, which probably is okay. But in terms of property, you use the total value of the property, which includes the building and the land on which it sits. And the land is going to be there all the time. So why do you include that as part of a depreciating asset?
No, so the land is non-depreciable, so we do separate that
Separate
out,
that out,
and
yeah.
we just depreciate the property. I'm hoping that's clear in here now, but I will check that later. That land is non-depreciable. As for the straight line depreciation, I mean, arguably, yes, you could say on a vehicle, for example, it's possibly not as appropriate. However, what we are doing are following the CITFA code and their guidance. And like you say, when you've got a number of assets, it has less impact, particularly in that first year. The other thing that I would say is the value of our vehicles in particular are not material assets. So the depreciation charge ends up being quite minor in the Waverley accounts anyway. So I would suggest that it probably isn't having a material impact overall anyway. But arguably you could say vehicles perhaps isn't identifiable where depreciation hits heavily in the first year. But for other assets, we would need more advice externally to be able to make those judgments. We wouldn't have the knowledge in Waverley, I don't think, to do anything different to the CITFA codes expectations.
There's no value to the authority of moving away from the CITFA code as far as depreciation is concerned, because it doesn't actually count towards any of our funding calculations. The only purpose of depreciation is to provide accounts which are UK GAAP compliant across the whole accounting sphere, including company and charity accounts. It doesn't actually provide us with a measure of economic benefit to the authority as such. Provision of vehicles, land, buildings, etc. So under the capital financing regime, which is completely different to depreciation. So if we're borrowing, we pay minimum revenue provision, which is it is a proxy of depreciation in some ways, but it's a whole lot of technicality. There's no value in us getting technical on depreciation and spend money on that. Following the CITFA code is appropriate as it makes it accounts comparable in the local government world.
Okay. I noticed also on page 9, you've got a bit of red text in here for the
Yes.
discount rate of 2.7%. That's to be confirmed still.
Yes, we haven't yet had the actuaries valuations for 22-23 or 23-24. So they normally come in after year end when they get the final information regarding salaries and pension information right at year end. So they will provide us with that value once we get into the second or third week of April. But that is lifted direct from their report as the experts in that field.
Do we need that number before we have our special meeting to approve the accounts?
So
We have the 21-22 accounts, which would relate to the set of accounts you'll be approving. We may have the 22-23 number that we can share at that point. It partially depends on the actuary and how quickly they can get their year-end reports out.
it won't have any relevance in the 21-22 accounts. So I'd expect to see a big difference between the two because of the economic situation changing.
Can I doubt? So 2.7 is that the number for the 2021-22 two accounts?
Yes.
I'm expecting some sort of increase, I would think, given what's happened to interest rates since.
Yes.
Yeah.
And where that number comes from, did you say?
Hyman's, our pension actuary, they act on behalf of most local authorities. They sit independent of the pension fund.
Right. And you always use that number? Or you always use them as to supply the number? Would it
Yes, so
not then be best just within the policy, just to say that's where it comes from, and you don't have to then quote a number year on year on year?
There are disclosures within the accounting, SIPFA's accounting policies that we have to follow, which are compliant with UK GAAP. So regardless of source of information, there's a certain set of numbers we have to follow.
You got to report a number.
We absolutely.
Okay, fine.
Long-term good. Average long-term good. 20 or 30 years.
It's based around that, that we have to use the number that the actuaries provide.
Sure, yeah.
Right, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd love to comment on the text, but since it reads like a third year advanced examination question, comprehension question, way beyond me, but at least in the time I was prepared to vote to it. But that's neither here nor there. It's very well drafted, and we've seen it all before, so I'm sure it's fine. What is missing though, all going in, there's no document control on it.
Noted. I'll take that one away.
Because it is an important document, and document control is somewhere where you can actually put the fairly minor changes to it, so that there is an ongoing record of legal.
It's an extract from the statement of accounts, so it actually sits within the statement itself. We just brought this picture to say. So, Chair, one of the things you need to consider as a committee is the completeness of these policies in respect of the external environment in which the council operates, as in what's changed around this council that may require a change in policy or something new that's gone on in the business. Consider. I personally can't think of anything specific. I don't think collaboration has a particular effect on our accounting policies. It's still affecting us economically in a particular way. We haven't any change. We've had no changes in our revenue streams as such. But we have revenue streams coming on board that we think about. The biggest challenge we've had in recent years has been the grant accounting, COVID grant accounting, where we've been agency. And you'll see coming through the audit finding report, there's been a bit of sorting out between what's agency and what's actually principal in terms of accounting for those grants, i.e. stuff that grants that belong directly to Waverley and grants that Waverley's dispersed on behalf of whatever the scheme is put in place, which isn't directly an accounting policy, but there's some accounting adjustment required through that. So from my view, they are complete and comprehensive from John's thing.
You wouldn't expect to see any major changes in the policy, normal work.
No, part of what Rosie does is she looks at that as the year goes through and considers any changes that are happening, changes in systems, anything like that would affect valuation, any number in the accounts.
Chairman, could I ask one final question, purely from 121, 1.21, page 22. You just give me an example of what an unobservable input for an asset is.
Thanks for that challenge, Councillor.
It is in our accounting policies.
I'm sure it is. Straight up the SIP policy.
So Stephen, could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch what you said.
If you look at the way in which we deal with fair value measurement, there is a hierarchy of inputs. And the worst of all, surprisingly, are the unobservable inputs, and I was just scratching my head as to what that was.
So what it's getting at is this: it's from an asset valuation perspective. There's 3 levels of assurance that's given from a valuer's perspective. And as it says there, the best level of assurance you get is where there's something quoted on an active market. You can tell what value is. Then the next medium level insurance is where there's a market value, but it's a few people putting a finger in the air. It's not a traded market as such. And then there's valuation, which effectively comes down to one person looking at some indices and just a few local trades on property, coming up with the best guess. That's effectively what it's getting at.
Thank you.
It's an art, not a science. And it does cause problems with auditors.
Are there any more comments from members on this document? So we're happy with the content? You've noted it? Okay, thank you. Good, so just move on then. Thank you, Rosie. Move on to 7, which is the risk management. Any updates that you're aware of, Peter?
No, in a nutshell.
Mr. Chairman, I did actually send a note to both Robin Taylor and to I'm so sorry, my brain's completely gone. The gentleman who deals with LPP2.
Andrew Longley.
Thank you. It completely gone out of my head. Andrew Longley, and both of them were indicated that there was no updates to it.
Thank you very much. That deals with item then. Thank you. Item 8 is the annual government statement. Right, so I know that we have a speaker
We do.
on this one. Let's ask him to speak now if we can. Good evening, Councillor Hyman. Could you hear me?
Good evening, Chairman. Yes, because you've got a microphone in the middle of the ceiling, it is very difficult to hear some of the things that are said, but it's been clear enough to me so far. Thank you very much. But if you'd remember that you need to point your heads up at the microphone and speak clearly for the webcast to pick up everything. I think it's in the middle of the ceiling somewhere. I don't know. Perhaps have fun looking for it. There are a number of matters, numerous governance issues at the moment. For instance, I cannot get vital documents. I cannot get answers to some questions, particularly ones of whereabouts the from where the authority to take certain and make certain decisions has come from. But there is one fundamental matter which has become urgent, a very urgent matter of governance because of impending planning appeals that are imminent. Now, the 21st of February Council, our representative, councillor on the Joint Strategic Partnership Board, Martin Darcy, confirmed, and I'll quote, he stated, I do agree with Councillor Hyman that Natural England have not produced evidence and that they've acknowledged that they've not produced evidence. So despite what legal advice may say, I would say we cannot do an appropriate assessment, is what he said. And obviously now at the last executive, I explained that the burden of appeals can all be avoided by instructing officers to admit to inspectors from the start at appeals that neither Natural England, Waverley nor the inspector can conduct a people over wing compliant appropriate assessment of mitigation, and that all we need to do to protect Waverley is to instruct officers, or for him to instruct officers to go into those appeals and tell the truth from the start and state that we cannot conduct appropriate assessments at the moment. The leader stated in response that we can't do that, that he doesn't have the power to do that, from which we have to assume that he, the mayor, the councillors, residents simply cannot force officers to tell the truth in appeal hearings. This is a big issue for us, because obviously we're all bound by the Nolan principles of truthfulness and leadership, but we've got to hold each other to account and tell the truth. So my question, and I'd like it answered tonight if possible, but appreciate I might need to have it in writing, but it is an urgent matter. What process is available to us to ensure that the truth is told in these appeals in order to protect our residents and the bird species and ourselves? So I suppose, how can we as councillors ensure the Nolan principles are upheld in such a situation? Is it true that we as councillors, the leader and the mayor, cannot require that officers tell the truth at appeal hearings? So That's a big issue, significant issue that it comes up next week with the first of the big appeals that are coming up, or perhaps second if you count Hawthorns in Farnham. We've got Lower Webburn Lane, 130 homes refused last time as appeal on grounds.
Councillor Hammond, we have the leader in the room with us, and I think he's happy to answer, at least speak on one of those points you've raised.
Okay, well, I'd like an answer to the question rather than just speaking. Can I please? What process is there for us to ensure that the truth is held is told at appeals? That we cannot at the moment conduct appropriate assessments, and so no one else can either. Thanks.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me come in on this. I wasn't even intending to be here, let alone speak on this item, so please forgive this non-prepared response. At no point did I say I couldn't instruct members of staff to tell the truth. My assumption is that they do as a default, and they don't need to be told. And to be blunt, if somebody instructs somebody to tell the truth, it probably makes no difference, really. They're going to be telling the truth or not, as opposed to their own way they work. So it's not an instruction I think I could give at Waverley Borough Council that would really make any sense. Just to also comment that, and I believe Liz Townsend would say the same if she were here, the reasons why these appeals are challenging are not because of Natural England, they're challenging because of the tilted balance. That is why we have these issues with the appeals, and not because of Natural England. Councillor Hyman, if you were correct on your assumptions, the inspector at the LPP2 hearing, which you presented to for some time, would have sustained your arguments in his own decision regarding the soundness of Local Plan Part 2. Don't get me wrong, I kind of wish he had sustained your arguments, but he did not. And so we are where we are until a review and update of Local Plan Part, well, the local plan in general can bring any of these things into effect. And again, if Natural England are actually funded properly by the government to do the job in which they are tasked by law. I do not believe that there are Waverley officers who are going into appeals and lying to other planning inspectors or indeed anybody else. They are doing the best that they can with the information that they have under a planning system that is generally speaking weighted against us. And I would again ask you, Councillor Hyman, to not assume by default that members of staff are lying. And if you have evidence that they are, I suggest that you present that in the proper form rather than making these unfounded assumptions at every single opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Leader. You have another point to make, Councillor Hyman?
Well, thank you. That evades the question, because obviously we know the fact is that we can't conduct an appropriate assessment, and we also know, therefore, that the inspector in the Local Plan Part 2 must have assumed that we can, because he's been misled by the documentation. So, the whole point here is that if you're going to ignore the fact that we can't produce an appropriate assessment and ignore the law, then your argument stands. But if you're going to argue on the tilted balance issue, paragraph 182 of the MPPF makes it perfectly clear that the tilted balance and the assumption, the presumption in favour, does not apply where you don't have an appropriate assessment. So if you're saying we do send it,
40 seconds.
40 seconds. Do you have another point to make, Councillor Hyman?
No, that will do. I am just absolutely amazed that, having been proven correct by the courts, that people are still pretending that we have an appropriate assessment, even though it extends to all the people who were not telling the truth for 15 years prior to people over wind. The people are still pretending that we have an appropriate assessment of that Farnham Park's imaginary mitigation works, and we're selling that mitigation to developers so that they can have a planning consent unlawfully, and this is a ridiculous situation, and I'm just being told I'm being insulted by the leader and by others when all I'm saying is we do not have an appropriate assessment. Will you admit it or not?
Wishes to make a comment on what you've just said.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just to say, the council doesn't sell the concept of SANG to anybody. As I've freely admitted several times, I actually personally don't think SANG actually works very often in terms of what it actually delivers, i.e. suitable alternative natural green space. However, that is the law and planning policy. I don't like quite a lot of the law and planning policy, as is probably quite clear to most members by this point, but it is what it is. And I'd also just conclude by saying that if I had the capacity, or any of my colleagues had the capacity, to hoodwink every planning inspector under the sun, I suspect I wouldn't need to worry about elections. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Councillor Hyman. It's an argument you've raised many times, and you've had answers in spades saying that the council has taken all the necessary steps to prove what it's doing is within the law. So thank you for your comments.
Would you just provide me with that appropriate assessment then, please, Chairman? Thanks very much indeed.
Any more comments, any more input onto this item from members? Bishop.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. A couple of points. I mean, firstly, I think the issue we discussed earlier about the delays in approval of accounts is a governance issue. I mean, it's not a it doesn't reflect badly on the council, but but members of the public will see that, you know, that they don't realise that we're being held up. We just haven't delivered a set of accounts. So I think it ought to be recorded as such, and you know, with an action to work with the government and with the audit authorities to try and come up with a better auditing solution. It is a governance issue. I don't think we can avoid that. So I would propose that that be included in the governance, the annual governance statement.
We put that as a reputational risk.
It's a reputational risk, yeah. I think so, yeah. Just largely because people don't understand that it's not our fault. It's just there are no accounts and no published final accounts with an audit statement. So that's point one. And then point two, which just suddenly struck me reading through a later paper, is that during the course of this accounting year, which is just about to come to an end, our freedom of information process, which is covered later on, hasn't been up to date, and it was due to be updated by the end of this financial year, but it's had to be delayed due to lack of resource, and it was a series of red risks. So, you know, it will be sorted out, but as it stands, it is, I would assert, a governance issue because it is pretty important, given that it involves red risks. And it's easy to, it can be stated, and it can be stated that it will be fixed, and so, you know, it's not that big an issue going forward, but at this point in time, as a governance issue, we've gone through 22, 23 with inadequate freedom of information training and process. So I would propose that that would be a worthwhile thing to include.
Members be happy with that? Okay, thank you. Any other comments? No? Okay, thank you very much. Then that's item 8 completed. Let's move on to item 9. Which I guess it's the Gale show, is it?
Yes. The majority of those, the next one's coming up on mine. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so agenda item number 9 relates to the progress of the internal audit plan. And as you can see in the annex, good progress is being made. And obviously at this time of the year, it's the most of the reviews that are to be started have been started. But you will see in the document there are a few that have been deferred, and those are marked in red in the different pages from page 8 onwards on the right hand column there. You can see there one council tax scheme that's actually been removed because there was a Surrey County Council exercise done, so it was deemed it wasn't appropriate for us to carry out another review in that area. That was not particularly relating to a single person discount, but we are actually going to be looking at the council tax base management this coming year on 2023-24, and there are a few of the reviews that have been deferred just due to the fact that the resources within that service area weren't available due to staff either long-term absence or leave, etc. I think actually one of them was of long-term absence due to sickness. So therefore, that has been deferred. That was relating to mutual exchanges. And as I say, the contractor is making good progress on, the waste, green waste, that was deferred due to the delays in the new code system being implemented and developed. So that, in effect, will be getting done in the first quarter of the new financial year. And on pages 12 and 13, you can see the reviews that have been either deferred or removed, and those that have been added in. And page 13 gives an overview of the small budget that I have.
When you talk about the green waste, what does that actually entail in your audit of that?
Well, in the green waste, it would be looking at the actual new system itself to make sure the new system is doing what we expect it to do regarding
gathering in the income, even the new front portal where members of the public can register if they're interested in having it, and for that process flowing through to the bin being delivered, their income, obviously their income being collected, the bin being delivered, and then it being set up through the system, and any other peripheral income that has been, make sure that's been recovered in an appropriate way. Sounds simple, but it's quite a complex system.
Chairman, thank you. Just a couple of questions. One, could you just clarify for me the different levels of assurance opinion? I know you've got reasonable and advisory, but I'm just not familiar with what the scale. Is there an excellent and a fail, or?
I'll refresh my memory now. With the reasonable, that is mainly the basic, the general one that they're happy that everything's content.
Yep.
We then have a limited, which means there's limited assurance, which means that they have there's a lot more work needs to be done.
Yep.
And they're being concerned about the control environment. And then the advisory one that you have here, that is generally a review where it's more generally when I've looked at a review where I'm advising where the things that need to be resolved to actually make sure that the system is actually functioning, not just in controls, but on the everyday, like the customer side, ensuring that that's been improved, or recognising where there's improvements that can be made to the system, not just in the controls.
So in the hierarchy, is advisory stronger or better than reasonable?
Advisory in effect is not actually given an opinion, it's actually just stating the fact that it's an advisory view.
Okay.
And we also have another category which actually is no assurance at all.
Right.
So because you have your limited, then you have your no assurance. When it's a no assurance, it's a red, and that's when obviously very rarely, shall I say, we have had red, but when it's a red, that's when obviously that is signaling there's something fundamentally wrong and it needs to be sorted now.
So can I just follow on from that? I mean, I picked up the same point. So the definitions are on page 32 and 33. So it's all there except advisory isn't. And I probably should have picked this up sometime. There's a bit of housekeeping. Could you slip in a sentence just to tell us what advisory is? So I got to exactly the same conclusion. What's this? And then I went back and looked in previous months, and sure enough, there it is then. So I should have asked it about 6 months ago. I'm just very slow at coming to the point. But thank you. That's my lasting legacy, is that the next report will have advisory.
Well, actually, as you can see, these are separate classifications that the auditors use. Whereas the advisory one is a bit like having ad hoc consultancy.
Got it.
So I couldn't actually put consultancy in there, but I like to call it more advisory, because I'm advising as to these are the steps we need to take to improve that system. Because sometimes it can be looking at a system, looking at a system that has just recently changed, and then actually giving them advice as to how they can improve it even better than what it is. Because I can't be, because there is only I can't sit on every project to actually provide that advice as a project is developing. So I get to look at it as and when it's usually going in. Not all the time, sometimes I do get pre-warning that they are making changes, and then I can advise as to go.
Mr. Chairman, I had just one other, again, probably my own ignorance. Page 9, the property terrier.
Yes.
Very briefly, what does that entail? What does that entail?
The property terrier actually provides all the information related to the properties that we hold, and also even the leases that we give to others within the context of what we want in Waverley.
Thank you.
We'll just come back one more point. A lot of the work that was started in Q2 still hasn't got to the report stage. So we're sort of 5 months on from Q2.
Yes.
Is that indicative of an issue?
I think, well, it is indicative of an issue, and I think that issue mainly is the fact that you have the executive heads of service trying to deal with two councils, because obviously executive heads of service are involved in this in each of the reviews, and most of the shall we say the delays is coming through from actually trying to
push forward these reviews when obviously they're dealing with other issues. So there has been a lack, I would say a lack of responsiveness. No, they obviously they have priorities, we have priorities, and it's just trying to manage those priorities the best we can. And I know that the contractors have got quite a lot of closure meetings coming up in the next 2 weeks or so, because obviously the executive heads and the managers have obviously been dealing with other issues.
So is that an issue then that you expect to continue, or are you hopeful that it will resolve as the executive heads become more familiar with working across the two councils?
Yeah, I do think I can actually see that now, when the executive heads are becoming more aware of what their role, what's expected of them within the role, and obviously how important internal audit is, to ensure that systems are good governance systems are in place.
And just following up on that, is the Joint Governance Committee aware of that as a potential issue and monitoring it?
Well, all the reports that, particularly the reports regarding the audit, they've actually all been to the executive heads of service through the joint management team, and also the strategic directors and the chief executive as well. So they are aware of the position, but also the status of the fact of progress being made. I think it's recognised that progress has not been made as swiftly as we would expect it to be, but I think we have to balance that against the availability of those key staff.
Sure. Thank you all. Any other comments?
Very quick one. Was this provide to CAP as LC replacement?
CAP is the Southern Internal Audit Partnership. That's our contractor we use at the moment. And basically the LC is land charges. So originally this was, that particular review was a review that I was going to do, and because my time was taken off to do something else, the contractors were provided with that review as a replacement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. So we have noted the contents of the internal audit progress report. Thank you. Item 10, proposed internal audit plan.
Now, as you'll be able to see from the introduction of the report, I've gone through my normal process of risk assessing the audit universe that we've relayed, consultation with executive heads of service, strategic director and the chief executive, and now today I'm presenting the outcome of that work, and there's not much really to say on that apart from this is the output.
Any compliments?
Yes, it's probably. So the figure on page 50 has evolved from the last version of that, and it worries me a little bit in that you're now showing the internal audit manager reporting only directly to the joint executive head, i.e. the fox is guarding the hen house. And previous versions of this diagram have actually had a line to the chief executive, which I think we always felt was appropriate, so that if you were uncomfortable sitting where you were sitting and didn't want to be have the fox nibbling away, you could have that link. And also I think previous version had a line to the audit committee as well.
Yes, that's correct.
So is it reasonable to ask that a couple of arrows be inserted in that, or is this a deliberate change, and if so, why?
The chair, it's not a deliberate change. I have a sense of what you're saying. So I'm not able to be marking my own homework for me. So by all means, it's appropriate that Gail has access, which she has anyway.
So I didn't wish to be rude. It would have replied to Graham had he been here.
Yes, I wasn't taking it personally. It's a good observation, and in practice, Gail does have open access to the strategic director and to the chief exec. And to the audit committee.
Yeah. We understand that, but I'd be good at it explicit rather than
Okay, yes.
And then one of the things that arose at the, I think it was the last resources ONS was around, it comes up page 56, there's going to be a study into procurement, tendering and contract documentation, sign off. And I'm saying this with absolutely no indication that anything has gone wrong. There was a lot of discussion around the value, the balance between quality and cost in a particular bid evaluation for the housing side of things. And frequently our housing revenue accounts contracts are some of the larger ones. And to me, if the governance and cross-cutting review on procurement could have a specific focus item within it to just be clear that process is completely available and consistently used for these high value contract awards, evaluations. It's the evaluation side of things. There's a lot of discussion in the resources meeting about two very disparate bids, one of which was deemed to be technically difficult, but a huge cost differential. And it's just being absolutely comfortable that officers are armed with the right process to end up delivering the right value for us. No intimation at all that it was got wrong, but so much discussion, it's hard to articulate it. So so all I'm suggesting is that is possibly brought out a little bit more in that item.
To add to the words and introduce a new item in this section.
I mean, if it, a bullet at the bottom.
Quality against cost.
Well, cost versus technical balance in bid evaluation, particularly for HRA.
Chair, is that about transparency of process? The audit trail effectively how that decision was made.
I suppose it could be. I mean, the officers demonstrated that they've gone through a process, and and the individual independent consultants were used to do it. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of people in the ONS meeting that just it didn't sit well with. I sat back from it because I tend to respect professionals who've been invited as consultants to evaluate these things. They know more about it than I do. But having been in the role of that expert in the past, there are different ways of doing it. In my line of work, we used to have basically a technical pass or fail, and then there was a conditional fail and a cost to put it right, and the cost to put it right went on to the bid cost. So maybe you need to bring in 2 extra consultants to supervise, and there's a cost to doing that, and you can add it on rather than a sort of arbitrary percentage. But that's just one way of doing it. I'm not suggesting that's right either. All I'm suggesting is that audit take a look to see that there is clarity for the officers who have to make these difficult high value decisions on the balance between absolute cost and technical numbers.
Mr. Chair, I welcome that recommendation. So there is process, but it would be useful to see from an audit perspective that it's actually being followed and it's being followed transparently and documented appropriately and how these decisions are made.
That would help, so going back a few years from this discussion on some of the big building projects like Memorial Hall and Parliamentary, which overran the, as far as I understand, the projected cost, things which could have been looked at in this context.
Oh, that's a tough one to ask. I don't think it was one single failure in that process. I think it was a accumulation of issues that were building up with the contractor relationship that caused that problem, the cost overrun at the time. I don't think the actual tender process itself was a fault. I think it was subsequent.
Was that something which was easily identified, let's say, by somebody coming along to see and to try and assess where that issue occurred? So in terms of transparency? Is that in the public domain as far as it could be?
What I recall of it, it was, so the key issue really was about contractor performance and materials availability that was generating the cost overrun. And it was a bit 50-50 as to both issues contributing there. And it wasn't a procurement issue in terms of how we procure the contractor. That was done appropriately, transparently. It was performance subsequent to that was the issue. And also the inclement weather over a period of time. The building hadn't progressed. The building work hadn't progressed to a watertight state in time for wet weather, and snow, etc. That was the ingress and issues in the building. There was a whole load of things. And there was also a specification change halfway through. So there's a problem as well on that site. So the steel work had to be reworked. The steel frame had to be reworked. There's cabin issues. Materials. There was a lot going on.
Okay.
I would say that in terms of what I'm seeing here, the proposed areas are all ones I find, some sensible and good. I would comment that I think the IT business continuity should be a priority. It is in Q1, so having been delayed, I think that's really critical. But I'm having some difficulty overall in how to assess the plan, because you put down strategic risks there. And to my mind, an audit plan should be risk driven. So I can see that it is there. But because I don't have the strategic risk register or haven't looked at it or haven't been able to review it, marrying the two together. So what I can't tell from here is what isn't on here that we, as an audit committee, might be saying, actually, this is a high risk area that we want you to look at. So I think that's just an observation. I'm conscious we talked about the register and we're going to have a review, but yeah, it is, to me, it's a very critical part of this.
I think what I was trying, and I take that point on board, if I haven't had the risk register, but what I was trying to achieve here was trying to identify that the review is aligning with the strategic risk register. But of course you can see where some of them, and again it depends on the content that's in the risk register, because you will see there are some that don't have a risk next to them, because personally I couldn't align that particular review, but to me the review that's been highlighted is important to be done. So that's my comment on that.
Could I, this is delving back into my memory, because when I was last on audit several years ago, I seem to remember that basically you had a very large number of potential topics, and you would go through them year by year, so that over a 3 or 5 year cycle, everyone would be done again.
We still have the audit universe, but because we have now moved on from not automatically doing things every 5 years, because things like you probably remember, like payroll and council tax. If nothing fundamentally changes within a period, we would not now do that every 3 years, whatever now.
You wouldn't do it as a matter of rote.
Yeah.
I think the point Councillor Spence is making is that there is clearly some flexibility to move some risks, if you like, up the priority list and give them focus. And so I entirely agree that this only makes sense to an audit committee if it's first of all had a look at the risk register and determine what it thinks are the hottest topics, and then you'd expect to see those covered in the immediately coming audit plan.
Yeah. But of course, as an audit committee, you have an audit manager who actually makes the decisions, knowing what is going on in the service areas, having that knowledge and recognising as part even of the risk assessment of looking at the register, there is that judgment
that is
Sure.
then
And all
made
I'm
to
saying
deliver
is-
to the committee.
You would presumably find it helpful if this committee had a chance to look at the risk register sufficiently early in the process
yeah.
to give its own input as to what it thinks are the priorities, that you could take that
Take
on
those
board.
on board as well.
So I think I'm not sure when does, I mean, being an effective new boy after a long gap, when does the risk register actually get reviewed by this committee? Which meeting?
Tends to be informal, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of it's very sensitive, so there tends to be informal briefings, typically a couple of times a year.
Right.
We've actually gone quite a long time without having one.
Since I came on board.
I know,
Am I
in
right?
preceding years, it's probably come out.
You would probably need, funnily enough, I'm involved with the livery, sit on the finance committee there. And this is a current topic. And there the plan is that the finance committee will review the risk register in November with a view to seeing a report at its next meeting in February, which will then be approved and go to the court, which is their version of the executive. Would that time to, when do you draw up the audit plan for the following year?
Well, like, no,
No.
March.
So would it make sense for the November meeting of this committee to be then having a regular thing where it looks at the risk register, if it sees anything on there which it thinks should be on your radar screen, it can make its recommendations there?
It's a standing item in the meeting. We have that's every meeting. There's an item on the risk register as we have today to see what changes. So
Am I right that there's a difference between just simply noting what has changed and actually forming a subjective judgment of what is the most important?
Chair, who's got the AGS item as well, the governance matter to consider.
Sorry?
Well, the governance
Yeah.
agenda item also would inform the audit plan as to where there may be weaknesses in governance that you may wish to be looked at.
A thought, anyway, it's just the timing of when these things are done, which fit in best with the existing process of producing the audit plan.
taking that point you made, is that something we can consider as a specific item for a particular meeting?
If I can just interject, on the next agenda item, which is the Audit Committee Recurrent Work Programme, annual work programme, you will see that risk management is down for November 2023. And I think that was envisaged that it would be envisaged by then, Robin Taylor, who's now responsible for risk management, would in actual fact then be feeding back into the committee as to what new, improved or whatever risk management structure or process he was putting in place would then be ready by then.
And which items might be considered the most important?
Chair, I think to wait for us, I agree with November. I think that makes sense from a calendar and ongoing perspective. But right now, I think to wait until November to have that sort of detailed risk deep dive, if you want, is probably too long. I would still favour one in coming up in the next meeting, and then the regular deep dive in November.
There is also one in for September 2023 as well. Risk management, if required.
And as I say, it is a standing item.
Chairman, that's actually in some ways, funnily enough, a cause of slight concern. If something is made regular, it tends to be treated as routine. And my only other suggestion is that in the entry against risk management, including risk register review, to make that a particular topic, which gets special attention.
Maybe just follow up on, I think, from what was Asmara and Spencer have been saying. It's good that there's been this identification of each of these investigations against the risk register entry. But what I would prefer to see in addition is the level. Okay, you've got the risk there, but is it a high risk or a low risk, or what is the impact of it? And of course, I've got one of my personal big ones, which is business continuity. In fact, the first entry on your list in my mind, that is a critical thing to cover. And as I see from the current activities, you've already got backup plans, documentation for, which is all part of this, being able to cope with a unhelpful event. So I think, to my mind, maintaining, ensuring that we do have that disaster recovery, business continuity is so critical these days. We've had councils who've been Russianed, and they just basically stopped doing business, and that affects both their income, their ability to deliver services. Because to my mind, I would suspect they haven't got adequate business continuity recovery facilities in place, and it is so critical now, particularly since we have this incident in Eastern Europe, that we have we put more effort into ensuring that we are properly covered. And I think that we need to have that, as to my mind, as a top priority.
So, yeah, just carrying on from Julian's point about getting early sight of the risk register. The items that are in the recurring work programme are formal items for discussion in the meetings, but these are only approvable process, if you like. The reviews of the risk register, actually looking at in detail, have always been discussions that have taken part in informal forums, and probably need to stay that way because there's a lot of sensitive information in that. So I think the suggestion that it comes up fairly early can be accommodated, because it can be done at any time that's convenient for officers when a new committee has been constituted. Probably immediately before a meeting.
I guess, Victor, you're looking at an early session on risk in councils.
Chair, I think it's appropriate. Councillor Seaborn recommends that soon after the administration comes in, an informal session is had with Robin Taylor and his risk officers to look at the framework with which they're working. And it's been ramped up significantly from the framework we have been using, because there's been some significant change in the council's operation since we brought the last framework in. We've got a joint management team now, 50% of that joint management team are only learning wavelength, and 50% are engaged at the border of Guildford. So there's a significant change in control balance within the officer base, which introduces risk. Therefore, there's also been the external impetus of how the economic issue that's been going on. So there's all sorts the council's had to do in the last couple of years that she's introduced additional risk in. David just alluded to that as well. There's cyber threats that I'm looking at. So we put all that together. We do need a much more significant risk framework that looks beyond the strategic risks around delivering corporate plan and into service levels, which is something we haven't dealt with as a committee. In the last 8 years, we haven't got into that level of detail. It's appropriate now, looking at the risks that they're running as an organisation, that we should be looking at that level. And Robin Taylor will be working on a framework that does bring that level of detail forward. So it would be appropriate for the committee to have enough time to examine that in detail, and therefore an informal session where you can get into that level of detail, at least for an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever you feel is appropriate, several sessions to get to that. And then the frequency from there on in to see how it's bedding in and operational from there on. So it's really the committee's gift to really look at how you want that to work.
Okay. Any other comments on this item? Okay, thank you very much on that. So then on to item 11, which is the audit committee current annual work programme. Page 59. Anything else to say on this scale?
No, as I say, this is the committee's list of what you get presented to you. And there's one thing I wanted to add in. Was to change, Kimberly, the internal audit charter, which is in for March 2024. Although it would generally be in 24, can we also add one in for the June committee? Because obviously that generally would have come to this committee, but due to the change in membership, it was deemed more appropriate to bring that into the new committee. Yeah. And RIPA, on the November 23rd, November 2023, it's only 1p in RIPA.
Oh, did I put 2 again?
Yeah, 2p's there. We only need 1p. It's the Regulatory Investigative Powers Act.
Yeah.
Just checking girls looking.
Which obviously governs the use of covert surveillance.
Chairman, if I may just pick up on our previous comments, I would like to see the words "if required" deleted. Yeah, so it becomes a standing item.
Yeah.
How deep we go in, that different, but if required suggests it's in a bit of a casual.
Do we need one of those items in the June-July session as well?
I would think it would be very helpful for the new committee to be taken through the existing one and then to schedule in a review by the new committee offline.
Okay. Thank you, Gail. I'm happy with that one. Item 12, review the progress in the implementation of pre-detail audit actions.
Yes, as you can see on the Annex 1 to the report on the progress of actions. On page 64, there are 2 actions there to be implemented by the 31st of March, so they're in progress, so they're in hand. And then we have, so I was just checking, Nicola, the head of service, Nicola Haynes, for the freedom of information reviews, which obviously Councillor Seaborn mentioned earlier. As Nicola has obviously not long taken on freedom of information when it came to surprise that she had a review with lots of actions to resolve. And I think the team have actually, although there are a lot here, there are some of these some actions have, which aren't on here, have already been actioned. And you can see there's on the next page on 69, there's a few there relating to fees and charges where the executive head of services asked for extensions for those. And there's some there for revenues, sorry, it's a ground layer, revenues open portal. And there's one there on petty cash that the team will have. It's regarding reconciliation, so obviously it won't be done until the end of the financial year, which is in line with what I would expect. So on the Annex 2, you can see where Nicola has requested an extension of the 31st of September. So those actions are listed in the Annex 1 relating to freedom of information. And then the few 2 relating to open revenues portal, where the head of service, Mr. Vickers, has asked for an extension for his team on those. And fees and charges.
How realistic do you think these extension requests are?
I felt they were reasonable request, taking into consideration the, as I say, Nicola's here, she can also support to support her application, shall we say, for an extension. The fact that the team FY, there is only is a very small team, and there are still some fundamentals that Nicola wants to get resolved, and to make sure that the team have got the capacity to deal with that, as well as the day-to-day job of dealing with FOI requests. And I felt that the 30th of September, I think, is a reasonable request, and also for the Open Revenues portal and the fees and charges, I felt these were reasonable requests.
Does this reflect, let's say, a realistic assessment of how much work is done to date in terms of the package that needs to be done? So you can predict where that end point is likely to be.
Well, I think that's why they've actually selected for that 6 month period to enable the team, not just to focus on these improvements, but also to still focus on the day-to-day job. And it is hoped that the team have provided a realistic date of the 30th of September. As to whether it will be achieved by then, who can tell us what's going to come next into their entry, shall we say?
What's driving the high risk or priority on the freedom of information activities? What is the?
I think it was the fact that there was some shortcomings within the way that they were responding to the FOI, and it wasn't just within the team, because they're relying on the services coming back to them with the information that they require to enable them to deliver within their time frame. And therefore it was deemed it's important that everyone's made aware as to how important it is to be dealing with these within the time frames, because that's in effect that's what raises the elevation of the complaint even further, because obviously then people start going to the different ombudsmen whatever to complain about that we haven't dealt with it in the timely manner.
I guess if Nicola,
Yes.
I mean, these issues are driven by legislation, presumably. This is what you're obliged to provide in terms of the council activity.
We are, yes, we're obliged to respond within certain timescales that are set by the Information Commissioner, and that obviously governs how we respond, when we respond, and the sort of timescales around that.
Any comments from members, Richard?
Yeah, a couple of comments, more around process. Just a simple one to start with. In the presentation of these documents, can we have the description of the service rather than just head of service? Because there's so many, it's been musical chairs for the last 6 months, and then the next meeting is going to be a brand new. Well, it's going to have some brand new people in it who won't know the names. So we just have head of which service, because didn't come flying to me immediately which service I was looking at. That's a small point. When I first looked at the actions for Nicola, I was just basically horrified that it was going to take 17 months to sort out an audit item that's got a red rag rating. And then I looked at the justification for the extension at the back, and you have my total sympathy. You were stuck with this unenviable situation of a lot of stuff that's overdue. And what worries me is that the organisation should have been able to recognise that lack of resource was there before it coming to us at the last minute, when it's a fait accompli. We have little choice but to grant Nicola's team the opportunity to put it right, because that's the only reasonable thing to do. But it must have been apparent that this was going to be an issue 6 months ago.
Chair, the only response to that really is that there's been quite a change in personnel in offices over probably the last year in that around the legal department. So there hasn't been that continuity in terms of being able to drive the resolution forward, including the head of service still an interim position. So there's been a few changes along the way there, and it's been a bit whack-a-mole.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I think the point I'm making is that an audit report has been written 10 months ago with some actions that are clearly going to be very difficult to deliver because of circumstances. And I guess I'm probably looking at Gail, as head of internal audit. Someone should be tracking which of these actions is actually viable and which isn't. This was in the not viable category. And now it's come to us at the effectively the last minute. It's just about to become a due item, and it's a fait accompli. You know, there's nothing reasonable we can do but approve it. If we, you know, it would have been helpful to know 6 months ago that this was going to be a challenge, and we may have just said, okay, fine, it's a challenge, so let's extend it now.
Gail's always reliant on what the heads of service are telling her at the time, and has to make an assessment for herself to some degree. But she won't necessarily get the insight into exactly what they're doing. And it's reasonable for Gail to be able to rely on the head of service when they say something. I suppose in this particular instance, it's just that sheer volume of things that have been going on in that area, including the turnover, all the other pressures that are there. But this has just been one of a raft of, and therefore Gail's been given assurances. But I know Gail chases up on these things. Gail chases me on things. And, I don't like Gail knocking on my door because it means trouble. So, you know, to be fair to Gail, Gail is on it, and
yes,
she can only do as much as she's being supported.
Just one question for Nicola. Why are some of these only amber? It seems to me the entire freedom of information area is in a state of considerable stress. And I was wondering whether the distinction between red and amber is actually realistic, whether they're all in effect red if you're under this amount of pressure.
I think in the last few months, there's actually been a fair amount of progress against some of the actions. So as Gail said, we've closed and completed 8 of them, and we have started progress on quite a lot of them. There's also a new system in place. So I think we, in the last sort of 6 weeks, we're in a much better position than where we were in terms of moving forward on these. And there's a lot more focus on making sure that we hit that September deadline and do everything we need to do. There are some that are still red, there's no doubt about that. A lot of them focus around some of the more sort of HR type actions that came out of the audit. But I think there is progress being made now and going in the right direction.
Doesn't really quite answer the question. Why are any of these less important than any others? It seems to me you've got one topic which you've got to basically try and reach a satisfactory level of performance by September. And I don't envy you your task, but just actually interested to know why some of them were regarded as medium priority, whereas most of them are high priority.
I can answer that question.
Good.
This is when the reviews of it was originally done, and each of the actions is then given a priority, and the medium priority would have been set by the auditor at that time. So that's the risk was a medium risk,
right? Whereas
those that are high would be high risk. So at that point in time, it was assessed as a medium priority. So that's why some are yellow and some are red. But I take your point that at this point in time, it should all be red because they've not yet been actioned within that time period.
Thank you. Does that phrase it? I mean, is it normal? Is it possible to change the priority or risk level during the year? Would you do it?
I haven't done. No. Once it's actually been assessed as being that priority, it sits at that priority until it's actually achieved. But it is a valid point.
I mean, it just occurred to me that something might happen which would push something up. And in a sense, I think we'd like to feel that in a properly urgent situation, a risk level could be reviewed.
A question, Gail, really for something that isn't on the list but has been on the lists in previous ones, particularly the I think we had the on planning enforcement. We a lot of extensions of that. Can you confirm that those have been now
yes, done? If they're not on this report, they have been completed, and that was regarding the planning enforcement action. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it was the policy, which actually it went to ONS and then it went through the process. Yes, because I was provided a copy of that, because I'm provided with evidence of the action and it then gets uploaded to the Pintana system against each of the actions, so that anybody else looking at it can see the evidence that's there. This report, the cleaning of the report.
One of the issues that concerns me is that we don't keep a track of the actions that have arisen from the informal meetings like we talked about earlier. Like the need for a meeting on the risk register. One of the early ones when we were talking about Horizon was to have sight of the what is done to do the assessment of the performance of the code that's working correctly, the test schedules, for example. That was an item which came for one of those meetings as an action, but of course it's not shown here. So it's easy to lose track of those.
Yeah, it's just as to whether for informal discussions you have a separate action tracker. That's something I can suggest in future as
Kimberly did
discussed.
keep that previously,
We have
didn't
done,
we?
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's sort of lost its momentum. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
right,
But I think, you know,
action tracker.
to my mind, it would be nice to have it in this document, because this is where we're doing all the audit process, all the audit functions. What do members think? How do we deal with that?
I think that goes back to what we discussed right at the outset of our meeting this evening, which to ensure that the action items that which came from the previous meeting are followed up and documented. As you point out, that's one of the issues which we did look at during the informal meeting and had a response to. But it would be good, as I think you're implying, that this is documented and recorded back to the live meeting, so that not only this committee, but any members of our community who are interested can see it.
I agree with that personally.
But you've got an
I've
action.
put in big
to-
letters, action tracker reinstate.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comment on this item then? So we have considered identify any action, and we endorse the extension request. Is that agreed?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, well, it looks like we've got one more item in this area, it's item 13, which I think we should consider discussing this in exempt. Are we happy to do that? Yes. So to read out the formal words. Recommendation that pursuant to the Procedure Rule 20 and in accordance with section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the press and public be excluded from the meeting during consideration of the following items on the grounds that it is likely, in view of the nature of the business to be transacted or the nature of the proceedings, that if members of the public were present during the items, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined by section 1001 of the Act of the description specified in the appropriate paragraphs of the revised part 1 of Schedule 12A to the Local Government Act 1972. Information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information. So, can I ask those in the public gallery to leave the room and ask Kimberly to stop?